Today is a really exciting day because Theo is teaching for us all the way from Calgary. And so I just want to say a prayer for him before he leads us. God, thank you so much for Theo and just his willingness to step out and listen to your word and teach us what he has heard from you. And God, I just pray that you would empower him, speak through him, and that you would give us ears to listen to the word that he has for us. We pray these things in your name. Amen. Theo, I'll pass it over to you.
Different for me. I've got like my Zoom on one side of my screen and my notes on the other. So if you see my eyes reading, I am. So thanks for Grace, thanks for allowing me to preach and asking me to preach. She asked me a couple weeks ago and she said, can you do a service on listening? And I thought, okay, sure, let's give it a shot. And so welcome to the crash course for me on how to do a sermon. And if it goes off the rails, I'm going to say blame Grace because she gave me this opportunity. In the meantime, okay, so we're going to start with something a bit awkward, okay? I know it's on Zoom, so it's going to be even more awkward, but we're going to start with a minute of silence. Okay, don't go on your phone. Don't talk to anybody. I'm just going to challenge you for 1 minute. I'll tell you when it's over, to just be quiet and just take in where you're at, moment in life, how your day is going, whatever it is, and we're going to start that right now. Okay, that was a minute. Feels like a really long time when you're actually not doing anything. Personally, I don't know, maybe not for you. Okay, so I don't know about all you guys, but many times when I'm frustrated or I'm tired or I try to have a conversation and I'm not being listened to or I feel like I'm not being heard, it ends up sounding a bit like this video that we're going to watch. Joel, can you pull it up for me? I think some of you have seen this, and if you haven't, you're welcome, because now you have. And if you have seen it, just enjoy it, because it's hilarious.
Then you're not listening to me.
Then you're not listening to me.
I asked you not to do something.
No, but listen to me. Look at, if we do something, if you get that bird thing off, you're going to break it.
Okay, but I'm letting you know
But
that you cannot.
Linda,
I'm.
lick it.
You're not listening to me.
Linda,
Listen to me now.
Listen
to me now.
Listen to me.
No, you're not listening. I said no cupcakes.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, if you want, you can continue on in the video. It continues on, and it's pretty good. He was actually on the Ellen show as well, and we learned that his name is Mateo. So if I say Mateo, that's who I'm talking about, okay? And maybe this is the same with you sometimes in conversations. Like, again, like when you're tired, you've had a long day, you've had a long week in the season, it can just be, exhausting. And I find that oftentimes when I'm listening, I'm thinking about listening and I'm present and I'm engaged and I'm in the moment. But the thing is that I don't actually think about listening all the time. So my mind will wander elsewhere or somebody will say something and then I'll be like, oh, what's that? Like, what did they just bring into my mind? And I'll think about that instead of remaining with the person. And you'll see that, you heard it at the very end. Mateo is asking for a cupcake. Like, how weird would it be for him to be asking for some broccoli? I can relate. I'm a sweet tooth. Show of hands if anybody else is who loves sugar. Kelly, I see you. Yep. Okay, great. As I take a drink of water to swallow all the sugar I've already had this morning. And then I zoomed out even further and further than my own sweet tooth. And I kind of noticed that I find that what we want in our culture usually does a lot to make us happy in the moment, but it does really little to nourish us for a little bit longer than just a moment. And if you know me, you know I love fun facts and you know I love reading and researching things. And so I'm going to dive into some fun facts and context for the actual sermon part that we're going to get to. So give me 5 minutes and I promise you we're going to get to the Bible. But before then, here's a couple of things. We know that our culture tends to be very noisy. Steve Jobs released the iPhone in 2007, launching the digital age. And since then, like our media has just been like packed with things, and we already had the internet before that, and it's only sped up. And not only has our way of life sped up, but like the volume has just been cranked super high. On average, I had no idea, but on average, we touch our phones 2,617 times a day. That's insane. I did the math, and that's like a tap every 30 seconds, not including sleeping for hopefully in 8 hours, or actually conversing with loved ones or eating, you know? Other than that, we touch our phones 2,670 times a day. That's ridiculous. Now, there are good things about social media. However, for me, I find that social media often acts as a digital megaphone to broadcast every thought there was. And I mean, there was a time when you had to have a good reputation, a solid education, and recognition to be heard by the masses. But now it seems like everyone can just be entitled to our opinion and our thoughts on things. Mark Sayers, a really great pastor in Red Church in Melbourne, Australia, calls this idea colonization. My girlfriend shared this with me the other day. She was on her social media, and it was somebody that she followed posted this. It said, "If you disagree with me on a topic, unfriend me now." And I was like, what? What? Why? Because social media also gives us access to close off access to people that we don't want to hear from. Kate Murphy, in her book, You're Not Listening, says, "Our culture tells us that to be quiet is to fall behind. To listen is to miss an opportunity to make your mark and advance your brand." Maybe this could be missing an opportunity to prove you're right, or to convince, or to win something. It's losing. It's allowing the other person to kind of like have the foreground. Welcome to the upside down kingdom, okay? Here's another fun fact. The most common feature in congressional hearings is crosstalk. So in the Capitol building, where they're supposed to be making laws for the country that promotes justice and welfare and goodness and peace, parties are yelling over each other, and the stenographer has to write crosstalk because he or she can't make out what the actual words are. We live in an attention economy, we know that, but companies exploit our natural need and craving for communication by making us products that are highly addictive and distracting. Again, just like the cupcake and the broccoli, distraction keeps our minds occupied, but it does very little to nourish it. In fact, we're one of the loneliest generations in history. It's actually titled A Loneliness Epidemic, and that was pre-COVID. In a 2018 survey of 20,000 Americans, almost half said that they did not have meaningful in-person social interactions. Compare that to the 1980s, when similar studies found that only 20% said that they felt that way. So yes, we know there's lots of noise and very little connection. C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors, says this in his book, The Screwtape Letters. And pretext for Screwtape Letters, if you don't know it, it's about a demon mentoring another demon who is trying to corrupt a man's soul. So everything is backwards, and it's just a series of notes from a mentor demon writing instructions basically to this mentee demon. So Screwtape says this: "Noise, the grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. Noise which alone defends us from silly qualms, despairing scruples, and impossible desires. We will make the whole universe a noise in the end." And then he goes on to say, he talks about some more, and he finishes it off with this: "The melodies and silences of heaven will be shouted down in the end." So a couple weeks ago, we learned from Grace silence and solitude. And I want to say and note right here that whenever we enter into this discipline, we embark on an intense spiritual war against the enemy. So thanks for bearing with me through all of that. Now let's get some Bible for all of this. So turn in your phones or in your real Bibles or on the sheet that we have that Grace posted to 1 Samuel 3. While I'll give you a minute to get there, I'll give you some context. So Samuel is, he is a young boy here, which we'll get to. He doesn't have a personal relationship with God. He's serving Eli, and Eli is an old man here. His sons don't follow God, and his sons have goofed up big time. And it also mentions that his eyes have gone dim. That's cataracts, friends. It could also be symbolism. But I mean, I find that God often brings physical and physics and symbolism to the same, to meet. And I think it's quite a beautiful thing. Personal opinion. But yeah, when it says his eyes have gone dim, that could be cataracts, but it's also, he could be blind to like how his sons have been straying from God. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to turn there. I'm going to read it once all the way through, and then I'm going to go back and we're going to break it up into a few chunks. So, 1 Samuel 3. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, go lie down again." So he went and lay down. And the Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son, go lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again a third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Then the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." And we're going to end it there. And you're like, "What, Theo? That's in the middle of a passage." You're right. And I would encourage you afterwards to go finish it off. And I mean, honestly, if you have time, read all of Samuel. It's a great book. But now for the first 11 verses of chapter 3, let's go back and break it up. So we have in verse 1, it says Samuel was a boy, okay, at this time. And that translates to youth or mid-teens. And I don't know what you guys were doing in your mid-teens. For me, I was like playing hockey. I would do like a school show every now and then. But as soon as I had free time, I would just be playing video games because I just filled my days with stuff. I mean, here we see Samuel, like, like relaxing in the house of God. Like a bit of a difference, but that's okay. There's grace for me. And I'm sure there's grace for all of us. So it says, continues to say, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Does anybody feel like the word of God is rare in our days, or even in your own life? We get so caught up in shaping our identity or making our mark that we do little to just be in our identity as a child of God. It's like we're in a similar feedback loop of disobedient noise that the Israelites were in, like wandering around the desert for 40 years because of just disobedience, not listening to God. And you want to know how to cut the feedback loop? You just cut the noise. And here we find Samuel lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Talk about cutting the noise, okay? And being in such close proximity to God. And since Jesus hadn't come yet, the primary place for people to meet with God was the temple, especially since it says that the ark of God was where his presence dwelt. So Samuel is literally positioned in a place for optimal listening from God. And I just want to take a quick beat here and check in with all of us and be like, how do we position ourselves to hear from God? How do we cut the noise? How do we find that silence and solitude that Grace said to be able to be in a position to hear? We're going to continue on. In verse 4, it says, "Then the Lord called Samuel." And this is the first time we read this, right? Samuel runs to Eli, and he doesn't, he's like resting, right? He doesn't slowly, groggily get up and be like, "Okay, yeah, like, what do you want?" Like I would. He runs to Eli out of faithfulness and obedience. And Eli says, "I did not call, go lay down." Eli doesn't say like, "Yeah, go find that voice. Don't stop till you hear it," like with some motivational speech like our culture would. He says, "Yeah, go lie down," which I think is kind of cool. And I mean, I'm all for it. Who doesn't love a good nap? But then God calls Samuel a second time, and again out of faithfulness, Samuel goes back and Eli says, "Go lie down." Now imagine what Samuel's thinking, okay? He's just trying to relax in the temple, in the house of God, and he's hearing this voice, and God is and Eli saying like, "Go lie down." Like, is he delusional? Is Eli playing a prank on him? And then this happens a third time. Again, he's obedient, and he goes to Eli once again. And good thing, because now Eli's got some wisdom, and he perceives that the Lord is calling the boy. and he says, go back, and if you hear this one more time, say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. Now, that's a relatively easy thing to say, right? Given that you've managed to quiet your brain from all of the worldly noise and distraction. But what this means is to listen with a heart to obey in the translation. And that's tough. All of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I can listen, but now what happens when I allow my heart to be spoken to? Like that's incredibly vulnerable. Grace also said in her sermon on silence and solitude 2 weeks ago that that vulnerability, when it is unattended, can lead to destroyed relationships. And how often do we bring our hearts open and fragile to God and willingly ask him to give us a command, big or small? And I mean, if our heart posture is to obey, hopefully that's predicated on an expectation of a call from God. Now, if we don't risk being vulnerable with God, we miss the depth of a relationship in him. And the alternative is a surface life. So I'm going to take a quick break and just summarize what we've all done, because I went through a ton there. So Samuel positioned himself in a quiet place, laying down in the temple in near the Ark of God. He was faithful in his responsibility to go in to check on Eli 3 times. And he was humble enough to listen to Eli's instruction and open his heart to this voice. And it said, he doesn't yet know God. He doesn't have that personal connection yet. But he's like, okay, yeah, I'm here and I'm ready to obey whatever you're saying. So then it says in verse 10, if you're still following along, verse 10, it says, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Hold up, friends. He says his name twice. And we know when God says something twice that it's important, because how many times in the New Testament did Jesus say, truly, truly, I say to you, right before he dropped some truth? Many, many a time. I don't know all of them. Maybe Grace does. We'll get back to that. Anyway, not only that, but before this, before Samuel's been called twice by name, in the Old Testament, other influential leaders have been called twice by name at pivotal moments in their lives. My favorite is Moses in Exodus 3:4, when he's encountering God at the burning bush, and God says, Moses, Moses, and then it's holy ground, take off your sandals, and that's where God commissions Moses to go bring up the Israelites out of Egypt, and it's hype for me. I remember always watching that scene in The Prince of Egypt, and the voice of God came from the bush, and I'm like, this is like a human's voice, and then I'm getting chills. Imagine what God's actual voice is when he calls you out like that. Anyway, we'll get to that as well. Anyway, so Moses had his turn. It also happened to Jacob and Abraham, but now it's Samuel's turn, and with humility and vulnerability, Samuel responds, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. He says, speak, for your servant is listening with a heart to obey. And God calls Samuel to be a prophet, to be a divine megaphone. We talked earlier about how social media can be like a digital megaphone. Throw back thousands of years ago to where God is like, here's a divine megaphone for my people of Israel to share God's voice. Okay, and so Samuel steps into his calling, and he also anoints the first 2 kings of Israel. And maybe God is calling your voice twice, and it's at a crucial moment, and it's for your career, it's for your vocation. But maybe you're already in your vocation, you're already in your career, and that's amazing because God has given that to you. But maybe there are other things that God is trying to get your attention to. And it's important to notice that Samuel was in a specific space and time to receive direction from God. And what space and time are you in for God to speak to you? And like I said, it's not maybe that vocational change, but maybe it's reaching out to that friend. Maybe it's mending that relationship with a family member. Maybe it's how and where to put your resources for the month, time, skills, money, or otherwise. Now, I hate these catchy phrases that these really amazing, I love these churches and they do great things, but there's these catchy phrases, they give these one-line things, and it's oh yeah, my patience and my power, whatever. But I made one because I think it's easy because it distills into our brain in a certain way. So Samuel's proximity, persistence, and patience leads to God's presence. So proximity, persistence, and patience. Hold up, what? I just saw Grace give me a what? Yeah, thanks. I see you, Grace. I see you. And it says in verse 7, again, I'm going to shout this out because Samuel did not yet know the Lord, but when God pulls up, Samuel is ready to listen with a heart to obey. You can see I just typed this. God pulls up. Are we in a position? Are we in the proximity, and do we have the persistence and the patience? You can have both at the same time, which leads to God's presence. I'll leave that there for a minute. So we learn that Israel still has its ups and downs, but Samuel was the first one to put in formation stable, effective, and righteous leaders. And I wonder how many of us are too busy, creating our brand or making our mark, as Kate Murphy says, that we forget or are unwilling to listen. To hear God call our names in the quiet place and receive his purpose for our life, or just the next direction. It could be as small as a step or as big as a leaf. I don't know. So the universe has to obey him, right? We see that in the New Testament when Jesus is with his disciples on a boat and the storm is going crazy and they're crying out to him. And Jesus says, "Peace, be still." And the waves were hushed. And one of the first things that is spoken over us as babies by our parents is, shh. All of you parents are like, yes, oh my gosh, get those kids to be quiet. But I wonder how many times God is telling us to just be quiet and shh, to desire the broccoli instead of the cupcake, to break the feedback loop, to risk falling behind, risk being quiet and falling behind. To listen to what God has to say to our soul and to become present in the kingdom, which is eternal, blows my mind. Every time I think about heaven, I'm like, that doesn't end. This world ends. The kingdom does not end. And we get to be present in it every time we just take a minute to allow God to say shh, and we just find our silence and solitude, and we listen and we hear God. There's a wonderful quote by this author, Mark Batterson, in his book, Whisper. And it says this: "Those who dance are thought mad by those who don't hear the music." When I was in grade 4, I went to an orchestra for a field trip. And up to that time, I thought classical music was for old people who didn't have any friends or hobbies. But as I sat in the balcony and I heard the anticipated silence fill the theater, this anticipation came. And then all of a sudden, this sound so crystalline, so beautiful and gentle, just whispered from the stage and filled the entire theater. And I was overcome. I was this is music. I had no idea. And over the next hour and a half, all the other 73 instruments came in through the movement, and there was harmony and melody and structure and theory and just all dynamics. It was so beautiful. And I remember for the next week after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it or talking about it. And it brought me this joy that I didn't know that I was missing. And I think God wants to give us this joy, but instead of just an orchestra, his voice and his presence and his love. To find a quiet place away from the distractions and allow his love to quiet our hearts, and to offer our hearts in vulnerability and say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening with a heart to obey." Zephaniah 3:17 is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. I was at Dave and Kelly's. Yeah, I see Kelly. I was at Dave and Kelly's about a year and a bit ago, I think. And I was like, man, what would it be like to hear God sing over you? What would it be like? And then Dave was like, oh, there's a verse for that. And I was like, of course Dave knows. And he pointed out Zephaniah 3:17. And listen to this. It says, actually, no, I'm not going to read it from that. I'm going to read it from the Bible. Not that it's holier, but because there's 2 verses in here that I did not write in my notes. So it's 1 Zephaniah 3:17. "The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love, and he will exult over you with loud singing." I mean, I could end it there. That's it. That's all there is. My friends, this also makes sense neurologically, okay? My mom's a counselor, and so she was sharing with me, she was like, yeah, the base part of your brain, I forget what it's called, but when that is busy and when that is anxious or it's preoccupied, the rest of our brain can't think clearly. So it makes sense that God quiets this part. He quiets our hearts with his love. Our brain relaxes, and then he sings over us. The rest of our brain is available to hear him. Blows my mind, okay? God is just, I can't. It's so good. And so I'm not going to, normally we go into questions, and, I'll give you some questions and we'll go into break or groups and discuss. But along the theme of listening today, I'm not going to give you any questions. Instead, I'm going to ask you to risk. I'm going to ask you to risk being quiet and being with God for 10 minutes and just meditate on the fact that God sings over you. Like, imagine his voice. Imagine the tone of his beauty, the timbre of his power and authority, the dynamics of his love. Okay, that can be convicting, that can be encouraging, that can be comforting, that can be celebrating. It can be so much. His love is all encompassing. So I'm going to ask you to go for the broccoli instead of the cupcake, to choose nourishment over distraction. And so whether you're going through a difficult time, or you've got a really big decision to make, or a small decision to make, or there's a relationship that needs reconciliation, or whether you're in a really good place and you can just be thankful in front of God today, I'm going to ask you into a moment of just silence. And I'm not sure how much time we have. Excuse me, voice crack. I'm not sure how much voice we have. I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'm going to ask you to risk being quiet. And Grace, can I get you to come back on when we have time? Is that okay? Okay.
Oh,
awesome.
you can go ahead and turn your screen off if you want. And like Theo said, just, lead us in silence, Theo.
Cool. I'm going to lead you in silence. I'll leave my screen on. But I would just ask you to maybe like pick a quote that's in the notes, or if there's something that stood out to you today, I'm encouraging you to just sit, relax, and just meditate on the fact that God is singing over you even if you can't hear it. And hopefully one day we will be able to hear it in moments. Anyway, thanks everybody. And here we go, silence.
Lord, I just imagine that there are some of us who don't really know like what it means to meet you in silence, or what your voice sounds like. And there might be some of us who go to meet you in silence, and we have this picture of you, or this expectation that you're going to be angry with us, or that your voice is loud. So I love these pictures that Theo brought us, that your voice is like a parent who tenderly and graciously shushes their child. Like majestic and beautiful music that you sing over us. So God, I pray in those moments of silence in our day that we would hear you lovingly and tenderly speaking to us, beautifully singing over us. That we would feel your loving presence just like we feel the loving presence of a good friend. And God, I pray that we would be willing to risk silence, that we would be willing to maybe not have the last word, or not need to put our name or our brand forward. That we'd be willing just to slow down. We'd be patient and persistent in our pursuit of you, and that we would discover your presence with us. We pray these things in your name. Amen.